Um, so what I want to talk about is a question about shul. Specifically, and we'll try and get into this in a more detailed and technical way, is shul property? What do I mean by that? So it's interesting. There is, I just, again, if I had to search a legal dictionary that talks about the definition of something being property is the ability to exclude someone from coming in. How do you define something as your house? The way, and there's actually precedent in halacha for this, is that you can kick anybody else out who isn't allowed in. The Gemara in Masechet Bava Batra talks about, the first chapter is called Hashutafim, which talks about partners. And what it really grapples with is exactly this issue, or this question of, what does it mean for something to be mine? And part of it has to do with, well, can you kick somebody else out of it? Can you stop someone from coming in? Often, what is the symbol of ownership of a house? In Hebrew, the term is Mesirat Mafteach, handing over the keys. Why? If you think about it on a psychological level, because what a key does is it opens and unlocks the door. It defines who can come in and who can't come into the house. So the idea of the concept of ownership in that regard has to do with the rights or the ability to exclude someone. Okay. So I wanted to talk about the question of excluding someone from a shul. Now let's think about this for a moment. A shul, is it someone or any particular person's property? Isn't it a communal thing? And especially since shul is about prayer to God, it's about communal gathering, it's about interpersonal connection, it's about something spiritual. How dare you ever consider to exclude someone, not let them in? But yet, you could say there could be precedence. There could be a question of what is somebody who is disruptive or inappropriate or hurtful to the community, and therefore whatever the communal governance structure is should have the ability to say, yes, this person and this person isn't, and there could be security reasons and other reasons to do that. So let's talk about some stories and some situations in halacha that come from this. And the interesting thing to talk about is, of course, like we always try to do, the story of one of the decisors in this discussion. And it's somebody who I like to talk about a lot. I've shared, his story in a variety of different times. And it is the famous Rabbi Katzenellenbogen. I don't know if you remember that I've shared and talked about him before. Rabbi Katzenellenbogen lived in a city called Padua in Italy. He was known as the Maharam Padua. The reason why it was called the Maharam is that's an acronym for Morenu Harav Meir, and Padua because he was from Padua. Now, his story is a fascinating one because he grappled with this issue of ownership, not necessarily about property physically, but about intellectual property. He is the father of intellectual property in Jewish thought, the discussion of intellectual property in Jewish thought, meaning that he dealt with the question of what does it mean to own property that is intellectual. How did this come up? Again, we've shared the story before. I'll just recap the story briefly. He wrote a book, and he worked with a publisher by the name of Gustanini. He worked with a publisher to publish his book. Back then, in in the early days of printing in Padua, first of all, the Jews were one of the big reading populations. Not everybody was literate, but the other piece was that it was a very labor-intensive and expensive process to publish a book. And what's interesting is, and this is talking about, he died in 1565, so it's talking about the 1500s, the early days of the printing press. There was industrial spies, and there was an industrial spy who came to the printing house as they were putting into the process of printing his book, stole the manuscript, went and took it to a rival printing house called Bragadini, and printed it for cheaper and started selling it. And so Maram Padua was launched into this issue of what is the rules regarding stolen intellectual property. They didn't have copyright law the way we have it now. And so he was related to a younger rabbi named Isserlish, otherwise known as the Rama, Rabbi Moses Isserlish, who was a very prominent halachic decisor. And they were in very, very close contact, and they hashed through this issue very deeply. One of the conclusions they came to was the concept of a haskama. Haskama means an approbation. An approbation means that when we would write a book, you'd have somebody write a agreement, so to speak, to your book. What we think about that is that's sort of like an advertisement, right? If I write a book and somebody really famous writes a little thing saying, oh, this is a good book, and somebody will buy it. That wasn't the original purpose of approbations of Haskamot. What it was a way of showing that somebody is vouching the fact that this is an authorized edition of the book that you're trying to sell. So to prove that what you're going to buy it, you see, some great, political figure or rabbi or somebody who is a communally trusted figure signing their name, saying this is a good book to buy. That means that you know that it's legitimate and it wasn't pirated or copyrighted. So anyway, the Maram Padua, because of his background, was very involved in this question of property. And he actually struggled with it because he felt he was writing a book of Torah, and it hurt him financially that somebody stole the manuscript and printed it without working with him. However, he was struggling with the fact that now more people are going to have access to Torah. Isn't that a good thing? How dare I kick somebody out or exclude them from expressing their earnest desire, right? The average book buyer just wants to express their religious experience and learn Torah, right? The access. So, how can I stop that? How can I put a barrier in front of them when they're trying to just access the Word of God or understand the Word of God? And it was a really interesting struggle that he grappled with and struggled and worried about. And I will add a fascinating and tragic piece of this, which is that they came to an agreement that they would send out a letter to the communities who would buy this book, explaining what had happened, and basically saying, we're not telling you you can't buy the pirated version, but at least wait until the official version has been sold out, and then buy the pirated version, or if you'd like to, so at least we don't suffer financially from the fact that someone stole this work. The sort of sad addendum to the story was that the rival publishing house, the guy who pirated the book, was very upset that there was sort of retaliation against his publication, and he went to the church authorities and said the Jews are being dissenting, are being treasonous, and they're planning dissent to your authority, and they caused all sorts of decrees against Jewish study because of this dispute. So it was a very tragic saga, but it led to a explosion in dealing exactly with this question. And Maram Padua, Rabbi Katzenellenbogen, again, he was born in 1482, the late 1400s, early 1500s, the early days of printing, deals a lot with this question of property. So yes, Miriam, let me unmute. Yes. You're still muted though. One more time. There we go. Okay, go ahead.
A very naive question, actually. Of course.
No. I'm saying, please. We'd love to hear it. No questions.
Which is simply this. People know who the author of this book is. This pirate, who I now understand is not Jewish. I thought he was Jewish.
By the way, in those days, very few Jewish publishers. There were a lot of Jews who read books. Most people were not fully literate. And now so the non-Jewish publishers knew that the best business was to print Jewish books. So many of the non-Jewish publishers.
Now, the publisher that he brought it to, would you not think he would ask a very simple question? The man who wrote the book is still alive. He intends to publish it. He hasn't published it yet. Do I have the right, whether he's Christian or whatever, as a human being, do I have the right to take this out of the author's hands, publish it in my company for probably a few dollars less or something? Otherwise, it wouldn't be worth stealing. What would he get out of it if he's going to have it the same price as the other guy?
He undercut it in price. Yeah.
I have the legal right? Is there anything in this city that I live in Padua? Is there any council? Are there any groups of lawyers? Is there anybody like a mayor who has a sense of morality? Is there anybody who could stop me from doing this theft? This is a theft. I'm responsible. I'm the publishing house. Is there anybody or any group of legislation that has the right to stop this theft?
Great question. Yeah, Suzanne, I'll let you point out and then I'll respond. Yeah, go ahead, Suzanne.
I'm through with my question.
No problem. It's an important one. I'll try to answer it. Go ahead, Suzanne, and I'll answer it.
I add to Miriam, was a situation like that Jews had no chance of winning in a non-Jewish court?
That's exactly the issue. The issue basically was they weighed their options. And part of what it was it wasn't necessarily going to work in the courts, even though essentially it's a dispute between two Christian publishing houses, right? That's essentially what it was. But their concern was that when it comes about Jewish books, the courts would be like, leave us alone. And what the extra factor was that Bragadini, the quote unquote pirate, was very close to the secular authorities of Padua.
Jews are only half persons, right?
Right. So they were concerned that the justice system wouldn't work as well as it should. And you're 1,000% right. In theory, it's an open and shut case. I'm working with the author. I have rights to be able to publish this manuscript. Somebody else stole, right? They knew exactly how he did it. He sent a worker who posed to be a publishing technician, who then took the manuscript and ran away with it. And their concern was if we would go to do the official legal route, our adversary would may or may not win and would definitely cause problems for us. So they decided to try and do it more of a effective route of going to the customer base and informing them. Unfortunately, it ended up happening that the fellow did cause problems for them, anyway. So that was a really interesting addendum to the story. But you're right. And that's why they put in place, knowing that they wouldn't necessarily have the recourse they wanted to have with the secular authorities, they put in place a system where if somebody would do that in the future, they would have no one to blame the fact that nobody buy their books because it didn't have this approbation. It wouldn't have the haskama. Yes, Suzanne.
The Goyim didn't have Hasagat Gvul things?
They probably did. And I think it was, again, I don't know the case law back then.
How do you say it in English?
What, rules of, personal infringement, copyright infringement. They probably did have those laws. It sounds to me from what the research I've done on this was, it was just a question of, it wasn't the right climate to get enforcement. A lot of for example, you would, in certain times of communist Russia, you could take somebody to court, and if you were the Jew against the non-Jew, it would be an end of story, even if the official right was on your side.
And one more thing.
Yes.
You said that property means giving of a key.
That's one of the ways in which
Yeah, but
you
now I
transfer property.
understand דמי מפתח. Keep
Exactly,
on.
that's dmei maftach. Yes,
You have to explain.
yes, yes. That's exactly right. Yes. Okay, so let's talk. So this is part of the issue or question that he dealt with, and was often the authority that dealt with this because of his personal experience. So let me just lay out a couple of questions. Can a synagogue exclude someone from entry because of non-payment of dues? That's one question. What about the following? There is Scottsdale, Arizona, right? Beautiful weather during the spring. So in Scottsdale, Arizona, there's great weather during the spring, and they have many hotels that have Pesach programs. But there are communities and people who live in Scottsdale, Arizona. Now, Pesach programs are extraordinarily expensive, and they offer all sorts of resources, including hotel room, meals, and minyanim and shiurim. Can somebody, it's X number of thousands of dollars to go to the Pesach program, okay? And an enterprising young person rents a small little cheap weekly apartment a few blocks away from this Pesach program, and then goes to the Pesach program and joins and davens at all the minyanim, goes and maybe doesn't take any food, but goes and listens to all the lectures, goes to all the programs. Is it fair or right or appropriate for the Pesach program administrators to say, sorry, this minyan is only for paying guests? There is a really interesting, similar, it's all along the same lines question, cruise lines. So there is a whole industry of, again, everything's on hold now in COVID, but in theory, all industry of kosher cruises. And there's a couple of different kinds of kosher cruises. Never been on one, but this is what I hear. Where what you do is you book with your kosher cruise company. And what they do is they book a certain number of cabins on the boat through this kosher travel agent. And they provide these people kosher food, and they hire scholars in residence. Apparently, it's a lucrative circuit. You can be a scholar in residence on the cruise circuit. They hire a chazanim. They hire, they get a room for minyanim, etc. But they charge a premium for that. Same kind of question, right? So let's say the cruise line charges $1,000 just for a cabin on the cruise, just to get on the cruise. The kosher cruise line costs $2,000 because they're giving you a cabin, but they're also giving you special food and minyanim and shiurim, etc. Can somebody take the easy way, quote unquote, pay only $1,000 to the cruise line, get a spot on that cruise, and then go to all of the programs and to all of the the minyanim and shiurim and all the things that were put out by this kosher cruise company? Or can they say, again, you were excluded because you weren't part of our paid program? And these are all delicate questions that hinge on issues that go to exactly that question of, is this property? Can you exclude someone? Can you take it away from them? There's an emotional aspect, just like the Maran Padua dealt with this emotional question of, I feel bad stopping somebody just for my own financial gain from studying Torah, right? Or somebody's in a shul, all they want to do is daven to God. Can you exclude them for financial reasons? By the way, there is this similar question that goes to a much more contemporary issue, which you may feel very differently about, depending on how you feel about the previous questions, which is, what about if someone is convicted of a dangerous crime? Can they be told, well, because of your past and our concern for who you are or what you represent or your moral whatever, you're not welcome in our shul? Somebody who you have a concern is going to pose a danger. Can you say, hello, shul? You know, here's an interesting question. We have all sorts of COVID questions that somebody who answers the wrong answer isn't allowed to come to shul. What happens when there's a COVID vaccine? Would we say, all right, the only people who are allowed to come to shul are people who have been vaccinated? All really delicate questions that are going to hinge on obviously a lot of questions of, okay, what's the reality here? But are really delicate and complex questions that get dealt with. So the original source, we'll get to the Maharam Padua in a second, but the original source is Rabbeinu Gershom. Rabbeinu Gershom is a very famous, early sage. He's famous for a bunch of different reasons. He was known as Ma'or HaGolah. He was the light of the diaspora. And by the way, just as an interesting total different aside, so his acronym for his name was Morenu Rav Gershom Ma'or HaGolah, which Mem Resh Gimel Mem Hey, which is the same word as Margema or mortar shell, like a big gun. So, we bring out the big guns of Rabbeinu Gershom. But anyway, Rabbeinu Gershom listed a bunch of decrees. And this is a whole different dispute. Maybe we'll spend some time learning about it on its own. A question of how long those decrees last. Some of them are somewhat innocuous. For example, one of his decrees is no one's allowed to read anybody else's mail. This has a little bit to do with intellectual property. If something is addressed to one person, it is against the law that is enacted by Rabbeinu Gershom for somebody else to read it. One of the other things he mentioned is that you're not allowed to have two wives, even though that's technically permitted by the Torah. Rabbeinu Gershom is the one who instituted as part of normative practice that one does not have two wives. But here's another one, and I'll read it to you in Hebrew and I'll translate it. Rabbeinu Gershom wrote the following, and it's interesting because this is a common thing in many of our neighborhoods, what is known as house minyanim, or backyard minyanim. Rabbeinu Gershom said the following: Ish shehish'il beito lebeit hakneset. A person who lent out a home that he owns, or maybe it's his living room, or maybe it's his back house, or whatever it may be. Person lent out his house as a shul. So again, I have a property, and in the back of my property, I have a ADU, I have a garage house, and I renovate it, and I put it in a Sefer Torah, and I put it in pews and all sorts of stuff. And so now I make it into a place for people to daven. Okay. Then he adds one path. He says, what happens though if v'yesh lo merivai mechad mehakahal? I have a grudges. I got a fight. I'm cross. I have a dispute with one of the members of the community. All right. So I happen to live on Glenville Drive. I lend my house, 1520 Glenville Drive, that corner, it now becomes a shul. And the guy across the street on 15 whatever Glenville Drive, he and I have been, at odds. So I say, everyone's welcome to shul except that guy. Now, this goes to the heart of our property question. Can I say, this shul is a place of prayer on my property, and therefore, I'm allowed to decide who comes in and who doesn't come in. We'll get to later when it's a communal property. I'm allowed to decide, you're not welcome in my house. Technically, I'm allowed to do that. So if I make it as a place of prayer, I say, you're welcome to come daven at my house, and you're welcome to, but not you, sir. Are you allowed to make that, in theory, technically acceptable requirement? Basically, it's saying the Glenville Shul is only welcome to my friends. Yes, Suzanne, go ahead. You got to unmute here.
Okay. the two cases are not the same because with the cruise and the resort, it could be spelled out in the contract of the seller that people who buy the cruise cannot participate in the other group that has also rented this cruise, right? And
You
if
say between whom and whom?
I mean, the people who do the kosher cruise rent a part of a cruise ship. Usually, it's not all. Just they
Right.
don't fill it.
Mm-hmm.
So if something like that happens, and people know the cruise people know what's a good business or not.
Mm-hmm.
They understand all the intricacies. So if it's spelled out, there is groups. There are some closed groups there, and people who buy the cruise by itself cannot participate in that, because the guy who rents a place outside of the resort or goes to the cruise without the payment is really stealing. So
Well, he would argue I'm not
no,
stealing.
so is there and the other one is something different. So the question with the guy is there avera shegoreret mitzvah?
Yeah, that you're doing, Avera, and Matt is asking an interesting question.
You're going to buy
Right. Or let's say Matt's question, he's put in the chat, or let's say there's someone who lives nearby, and there's nothing to do lives nearby in Scottsdale.
Something else all the rest of the year. Or
Yeah, and happens to hear, there's a minion down the block now because of this local place. Can I just join? And can they pay? They say, no, you can't join because you haven't paid. Yeah, Miriam. I see you're unmuted. You gotta unmute.
Okay, your questions are so interesting because none of them have a straight answer. Because to each question, there's a yes and a no. There's a positive and a negative. So I just want to address three questions quickly because there are a lot more that you gave us. And one is kind of easy, which is if you're in shul, you cannot keep somebody out of shul. If they walk into an Orthodox shul and a woman is wearing pants, you cannot say to her, you may not come in and daven. If she doesn't know and out of pure ignorance, she's carrying a purse. It could be okay with the Eruv or not if it's not an Eruv. So you can't say to her, I'm sorry, you can't bring a person here. You let her come in and daven. If somebody else comes in and they disrupt the service, in some kind of abnormal way, everyone is quiet and all of a sudden they begin to talk loud out of turn or sing or do something which looks a little off, which it is probably, you may say to them, please be quiet, we have services now. And if they're not, then you might say to them, we will escort you out of here very gently if you do not stop disrupting our service. And then you can say to them, if you come in another time, and we know who you are now, and you plan to disrupt the service, then please do not enter our shul again. Only if you intend to sit like everybody else and not be disrupted. So that seems to be a kind of easy answer. The one that's not so easy is people who honestly want to join your services, but they're on a cruise and they should be allowed to daven, but in the original contract, to make this an easier choice, you might say that those of you who have paid for this particular program in advance and for our entire program are so welcome. And those who plan to join us, we must ask for a payment. We have many expenses to keep this program intact. We have many people to pay to make the program so successful, chazanim and this and that, and extra waiters, etc. Therefore, we ask a minimum of money from you, but we do need to meet our expenses, and this is what we're charging, and we think it's fair.
Right. What's interesting is that the response generally was, if I didn't show up, you'd be spending the same amount of money, right? I'm not taking any resources away from you. I'm just sitting and davening and listening to the guy's chazan, right?
Okay, so you have to have a good answer for that. I'm not
Yeah,
about.
yeah,
I'm not
yeah,
about to give it.
yeah.
I'm not the one to do it.
Yeah, Suzanne.
So that's just what I wanted to
Yeah,
address. But it's so nice on the one hand that people want to daven,
there you
that they
go. That's
want
exactly
to
what you have to
daven.
struggle and grapple with.
Is
Exactly the point. Yes, Suzanne.
exactly. And if they live in the neighborhood of the hotel and they look forward to the hotel meeting on Pesach, which means they can join lectures, I think a little fee needs to be, because you're paying for the lecturer to come out, maybe even pay his flying expenses. Who knows what the hotels do? I But since those particular weeks are so successful, and they always have been, perhaps you need to add a little addendum to those who live outside and just want to come for lectures.
So, yeah. All right. Go ahead, Suzanne.
I have to add another question. In case of excluding from synagogue, is a cherem not an intellectual censorship? I'm
Right,
talking
and that's actually what Maran Pado was exactly dealing. We'll try and get to that.
because I'm thinking about Spinoza. I'm thinking about Mendelssohn. I think things like that.
Yeah, Maxine, is that you trying to ask? You gotta unmute if you're trying to ask.
Okay.
Yeah.
I heard of a man a long time ago. I think it was in New York, and it was either Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur. He came to shul. He was very poor. He didn't have a ticket, and the person outside the shul asked him if he has a ticket, and the answer was no, I don't. And I guess the guard, or not the guard, whoever was the shamus, I don't know who was out there, said to him, then you can't come in. Do you know that this man never, ever set foot in the shul again, would never wear a yarmulke? And I think it's really terrible. I know we even do it at our shul. We ask for a ticket, and it bothers me. I understand that we all have to pay our way, and we do, but there are exceptions.
Yeah, so we'll try and see. We're never going to finish all of the different things. We'll try and see and address some of that. I just wanted to point Matt's question, if you see it in the chat, which we'll try to address. Is one of our cases was a Pesach program, and Pesach is famous for the kol dichfin yitzei. Anybody who's hungry should come and eat. That's what we say. So, how does that figure into this? And maybe Pesach is unique, and maybe that's just about the Seder, but not about davening. And we'll try and address some of those things. But I want to get back to the question was posed by Rabbeinu Gershom, and listen to what Rabbeinu Gershom said. And his case was almost an extreme, where it was, I own the house, and I have no good reason to exclude this person other than the fact that I don't like him, right? We had a business dispute. And so since I own the house and the shul is in my house, I don't want to let him in. Can you do that? Now, that's a lot less of an excuse than the fact that he hasn't paid to be able to support the fees of the things, etc. But so listen to what Rabbeinu Gershom says. Rabbeinu Gershom says, I've got to struggle with the technical property rights. And from a technical property rights standpoint, the house owner is actually right? It's my house. And whether it's nice or not nice, right? I'm allowed to, that's what I have the key. I'm allowed to close the door. And if somebody walks into my house, the nature of property is I'm allowed to tell them, no, I don't want you coming here. However, Rabbeinu Gershom says the following. Rabbeinu Gershom says, while that may technically be true, and I'll read it again in Hebrew. Someone who lent his house out to become a shul, he has a fight, he has a dispute with one of the members of the community. Eino rashai la'asra, ela im kain ye'esor oto L'kol hakahal ke'echad. And I'll repeat that in English. He is not allowed to exclude anyone, even if it's someone who he has a major dispute with. It's all or nothing. Either he says, this is a shul that everyone's allowed in, or it's a shul that no one's allowed in. And so Rabbeinu Gershom sets a standard here where he basically appears to give essentially a loophole in established property law. Established property law says, my home is my castle, I can kick anybody I want out. Rabbeinu Gershom says, not so fast when it's a shul. And when it's a shul, in the Mishnah Berurah, he says this, when it's a shul, you have the aspect of the fact that there's this spiritual component and the fact that there's going to be an embarrassment component. And how dare a shul be party to a, what I'll call a Kamsa and Bar Kamsa situation. If you're familiar with the story of Kamsa and Bar Kamsa, where there was somebody who mistakenly got invited to a party and he wasn't actually friends with the party host, and the party host kicked him out, and the story ended up deteriorating into the destruction of the Beit HaMikdash because of the terrible embarrassment. So Rabbeinu Gershom basically says, I don't care right now about technical property law. A shul should never be party to that. There's a guy who wants to come pray, and it goes to kind of the point that Matt was making in the question. A person wants to come pray. If you're a shul, how dare you exclude anyone? So if you would extend this, although he doesn't mention it in Rabbeinu Gershom, but if you would extend this to our cases, where you're on a cruise ship where you've rented out the third floor cruise library as your shul, and there happens to be an unaffiliated person, a person who is, just wants to check out davening and wants to pray, or maybe even a person who's trying to game the system and all along planned on davening at your minyan, but not paying the infrastructure costs. It seems like the Rabbeinu Gershom is saying when it's a shul, all bets are off. You cannot exclude them from entering. And we'll get to Maram Pato in a second, but Suzanne, you wanted to make something my point. Yeah.
This is not the same case. I'm sorry.
Okay.
Rabbeinu Gershom was very, very clever, because if he now the owner is saying either he is the man who hurts the whole community or he hurts only one, and now he has to allow him, because if they don't have another house to go to, because his is the only big one or whatever, he is now the one who the whole community will look down upon. It's his personality which now suffers. So
although Rabbeinu Gershom was not saying, he wasn't saying that this was the only shul in town. It was a fellow who on his block.
He
doesn't mention that. Yeah.
Maybe this house is the most convenient for the community. You understand? But and this other guy, all year long, he had another way to do it. So why now he has to be, do it on account of people who are paying,
Yeah, so you're saying that Rabbeinu Gershom.
No,
yes,
the other guys.
You mean in the
Here
Pesach
they
program?
can say no, they can exclude people from cruises and from resorts.
Because of the financial aspect.
It's not the same.
Right. So it's interesting because this is where Maram Padua, who we talked about, comes in. He said, there is, and this goes to the point that I think several of you mentioned, a difference between somebody who just opens up his house as a shul or someone who builds it with conditions implied or included. Like a bunch of people mentioned a contract. In other words, Maram Padua says, on one hand, you're right. I get it. You shouldn't be able to restrict access. How dare you imagine, like the story Maxine said, somebody wants to daven and gets the door slammed in their face. we've got to think about a bigger picture issue here of what this does to that person's religious experience, what it does to, that person's desire. Are they really taking anything? A lot of different questions. But however, the Maram Padua says, if you built it with the express initial permission to say, I'm going to have rights about entry and exit. Because think about the other direction, right? Think of security concerns, right? On one hand, yes, we want to be careful that there's not going to be somebody who is legitimately not a threat to anyone and not any difficult position, and let him just come to shul. Why are you making a stink? Let him come to shul and daven. On the other side of the spectrum, the people that Miriam talked about, you have to have some way of creating a system where the community doesn't suffer because of your open doors to all policy, which Rabbi Gershom is advocating. And so one of his aspects of his middle ground was that you can't just throw property rights out the window. And so he says, part of it has to do, what you can't do is introduce arbitrary new rules, like somebody who I don't like, I can't come in just because it's my house. However, if you build it with covenants into its structures or bylaws, those are binding, and then you are able to say such and such a person is not welcome in the shul. Now, it's a very delicate thing because, like I said, Miriam gave a phenomenal example of something that, should absolutely be a time where I think we could all agree if someone is a danger, if someone's disruptive, if somebody, we have security guards for a reason. And nobody's saying we shouldn't have security guards to make sure that people who are a danger, especially in a delicate security environment, that there should be people making sure that not everybody and anybody can just walk in willy-nilly. So that Maram Padua allows for that to build in covenants. What the Rabbi Gershom says you can't do is if just you're a shul, just can't just, arbitrarily, But I know that I think somebody had a comment or a question here. Yeah, Suzanne.
What about the person who is a dangerous felon who was released now, but he's apt to explode every time because he has anger? What about that?
Yeah, so
Kahal here more important than the tzibur?
So what's interesting is, and we'll give another example. What interesting is what Rabbeinu Gershom is essentially building in here. I'm sorry, what Maram Padua was building in here is a system of governance is allowed to make rules that can be binding. It's not a free-for-all, which means that anybody can ever walk into a shul in any way they want to, whenever and however. It's just that. And so I would say the practical expression of that is if there's a board of the shul, right? Or if there are bylaws of the shul that say things like there's going to be a process to, gauge whether it's a disruption, whether it's a danger, whether it's a communal, whatever it may be, to say for the betterment of the community, we've got to say who comes in and who doesn't come in. That's what Maram Padua allows for those covenants to be, or those rules to be inserted. Yeah, Miriam.
I'd rather not speak so much.
No,
I'd rather you
Happy
call
to hear
on
you.
somebody else, but I don't see it, but there are no other hands, so I
Go
will
for it.
talk.
Happy to hear you.
I definitely do not want to hog this thing. But I not enjoyed so much what Maxine said, because she said something that was very dire, very important. It's a new way of looking at the guard at the door, or whoever it might be. Some years ago, they hired policemen to actually stand there. I remember that in my childhood. They have to know from systemic order, just like that horrible policeman had to know with the murder that we all saw in front of our eyes of this black man. We literally saw a murder in front of our eyes on television. Now, he has to know that he cannot determine, and he is not the only one to make the judgment of what to do. It has to come from somewhere else. What if someone comes to you and they have no ticket? You tell them they may not come in with the risk of perhaps they're never entering another shul again. Do you say to them, did you not have enough money to pay for a ticket? Because that's surely not your affair to say that. And you may not embarrass them.
That's exactly
So
what Rabbi Gershom is
therefore,
coming from.
you need to be told as a guard that there are various things you can do. You can say, for example, I'm not saying this is what they should say, but there could be a whole list of things that they can say. One of them is, well, if you don't have a ticket, and we usually want people to have tickets to come in, then please wait till everybody sits down and everybody goes to their seat, so you don't make a mistake and sit in somebody's seat where they paid for a ticket. Let's wait for them to come in, and then you're very welcome to come in and perhaps find a seat and be willing to get up if it's somebody's seat, or wait till everybody sits, or if you might need to stand, would that be okay with you? If you want me to get you a folding chair, perhaps I can try to help you. In other words, we cannot exclude someone who wants to daven in shul.
Exactly. And that's, again, the delicate things. We're not giving any answers now, but what you're pointing out is a lot of the delicate nuances that need to be inserted and into those covenants with all these competing values we're dealing with. Suzanne, yeah. You're muted. You're muted. You're still muted. We don't hear you, Suzanne. Sorry, Suzanne, you were muted. We didn't hear you.
There is a person named Matt here who wants to ask a question, and this is more to the point, maybe.
Oh, I'm sorry.
In the chat.
Yes, no, I read that, you know, the question of davening, and what basically it seems that Rabbi Gershom's decree is that it goes even more extreme than what Matt was saying, which is once it's davening, free for all. Everyone, no one should ever be excluded from that. And the Mishnah Berurah's explanation is because, not just because of the nature of davening being an intangible that everyone should have access to, but specifically because of the embarrassment that will be caused of kicking someone out. The Maran Padua says, yes, but there got to be some limitations on that as well for the greater good. Yeah.
This is someone who lives there.
Right.
It is, I mean, so that's not the cruise case. And this case is, the problem is the guy is unaffiliated. Maybe he'll get affiliated if he once goes there, and he wants to go.
That's exactly right. Yes.
It's the Halach Mania and the Kol Dichfin and whatever.
Right.
Kol Dichfin is more for poor people.
Right. But no, and again, there's got to be, you know, exactly what you're describing, something, some level, and which we're not going to deal with, some level of making sure you find that middle ground. But what about, by the way, the case we know from our history of Hillel? Hillel was somebody who just wanted to access and learn Torah. He knocked on the door of the Beit Midrash, and they didn't let him in. And so what did he do? You're probably familiar with the story. He climbed up to the roof and he listened to the class via the skylight, and he fell asleep and he was covered by snow, and a whole story, right? What's the background of that story? Where does that come in? So perhaps maybe they had some of these things. You could also argue, like, how is this different than a concert, right? A concert sells tickets, and a concert sells tickets by definition in order for people to be able to get in and not get in. So factors that apply here are unique. The one aspect that Rabbi Gershom added is that somehow tefillah is different. But if you look at his reason, the Mishnah Berurah said it shouldn't necessarily be about tefillah, it should be, but just to never embarrassing anyone, to not let someone in. And what Rabbi Padua allows for is rules for that question of greater order. We're actually gonna have to stop now. Maybe we'll try and add this more because we've only opened the Pandora's box and haven't filled it. Maybe next week we'll add a little bit more to the discussion. I just see a couple of things from Matt as well. But perhaps in future discussions, let's delve into this, because I love the fact that we were able to have the conversation and not just a lecture to try and and dig through some of these concepts. I want to wish everybody a Shabbat Shalom. We'll be back at 11 a.m. next week, but 11 a.m. is going to be a different 11 a.m. because we changed the clocks this weekend. Also, just so they're on, I want to wish a happy anniversary to my parents. Happy anniversary. And I'm the beneficiary of the very special happy day today. Let's see.
Thank you, Rabbi. That was very interesting. And
right,
mazel tov to you on the anniversary.
Thank you.
Maxine?
Thank you very, very much.
Yes,
All
thank
right. All the best to everybody.
anniversary to your
Thank you,
parents.
Rabbi.
Hi,
Maxine?
yes.
There's a play. There was a play that got the prize for the Jewish play of 1917, which dealt with the case that you dealt with. The person wasn't poor, but he was non grata because I don't know why. Because
no.
he also liked another rabbi. Okay, so before his bar mitzvah he was excluded. So he never set foot in a synagogue again, but then his grandson became bar mitzvah, and it was important for him that he would. And the grandson said, only if you do it, I will do it too. So then he went and became bar mitzvah and became
Oh.
again.
Mazel tov. No, this,
was a lovely play in the Jewish theater.
yeah, that's nice. But this happened, and this person actually did become wealthy.
The other one became wealthy too. Okay, that's the problem. He was too poor, and something happened there. He couldn't.
He wasn't at the time, but then he did, and he didn't give to a shul, but he did give to like ADL and all the other.
Exactly the same case. I mean, it was a theater, and I'm sure it happened before.
Yeah, but I don't think it's right. It's
It's not.
it's not.
I